Hi there, and welcome to part 2 of our social influence notes. The last one just got a little too long, right? And so I wanted to kind of wrap up our discussion on Milgram's shock experiment and then talk to you about a couple of other important vocab terms. So make sure you've got those notes that you started in our last video, and let's go ahead and get started. So let's pick back up where we talked about Milgram's shock experiment. Again, make sure that you are totally just following along and watch that last video. But let's talk again about those results, and that 65% of participants obeyed all the way up to 450 volts. They went all the way simply because a guy in a white lab coat told them to. And again, I want you to watch this documentary that I referenced in that last video. So again, if you haven't watched it yet, you should go back and do it. So let's talk about why. So in our last talk about a research with Ash's line experiment, we talked about why did people conform. It's equally important to know why did people obey. Well, most rationalized their obedience because they felt that the experimenter was ultimately responsible for what happened to the person they were shocking. And in fact, you would even see them in the experiment looking at the person saying, what are you going to do about this? Like, they are screaming out, this is on you. What are you doing about this? So influences on obedience are really important. Prestige is a huge one. In fact, Milgram did kind of variances on his experiment, and where he put different, quote, authority figures in the room, and found that the higher the prestige of the authority figure, the harder it was to disobey. And that when the authority figure in the room was a woman, obedience went down. When the authority figure in the room wasn't wearing a white lab coat and had a clipboard, obedience went down. Presence of others who disobey. In fact, as soon as one other person disobeys, obedience goes down big time in any given situation. And really a big one is personality characteristics. It really does depend on the person. And you might think about like their childhood, but even what they do for a living, right? Are they an authority figure themselves? Well, then they're probably going to listen to other authority figures, right? Okay, so the next topic we're going to talk about is social dilemmas. These are situations where selfish behavior that benefits the individual in the short run may spell disaster for an entire group in the long run. And I'm hoping that your teacher does a little activity with this one that kind of demonstrates this for you. But if you think about it, it's simply the selfish behavior, right? Well, if I'm able to get something better, I'm not going to do what it takes for everyone else to benefit and me not get as great of a deal, right? That's just how it goes. And something similar, a type of social dilemma, is the prisoner's dilemma. So it's think of like Law and Order or Criminal Minds or those big shows that you might watch where two people commit a crime. And as soon as they're arrested, they're separated immediately. And the district attorney believes they are guilty but lacks evidence. So each can either confess or not, right? That's what the district attorney is kind of wanting to happen. So district attorney comes in and tells them, if both of you refuse to confess, each of you will be convicted of a minor offense and jailed for 1 year. If you both refuse to confess. If you both confess, the district attorney will recommend a 5-year sentence. If one remains silent and one confesses, the district attorney will allow the confessing prisoner to go free, whereas the other will serve the maximum 10-year sentence. So selfish behavior, thinking of what's the best scenario for me, spells disaster for the other person, right? So what would be the best outcome? Well, if they both compromised, right? And then they both get a good deal, you could say, right? I think it was 1 year. But if no years, no prison time is on the line, I'm going to do what it takes. And then that spells disaster for both of them if they both do that. Social facilitation, another important vocab term here. It refers to improved performance on a task in the presence of others. So it usually occurs with either simple or well-learned tasks, but not difficult or not yet learned or mastered tasks. So if you perform in any way, you sing, you play a musical instrument, you play a sport, you play chess, whatever, where other people are watching, you probably have noticed in the past, right, that when you know that someone is watching, whether that's a college recruit or your new like lady or man friend, right, they come to your game, you are automatically going to perform better unless it's a not mastered task. So it just is like that heightened arousal, right? And therefore you perform better. That's social facilitation, and that the presence of others facilitates increased performance. Social loafing is kind of sort of the opposite. The tendency for people in a group to exert less effort than when working individually. And the way that they found this is they measured individual exertion when it was one-on-one in a game of tug of war. And then they measured individual exertion when it was, let's say, 3-on-3 in tug of war. And they found that when it was 3-on-3, the individuals exerted less effort than when it was just them by themselves. Why might they do that? Why might people do this? Well, they feel less accountable when they're in a group and may view their contribution as dispensable or not important. And I think all I have to do is bring up the word group work for you, right? If you're in a traditional school setting, you know what it's like when you're in a group and you are either that guy, hopefully you're not that guy, or, someone in your group totally slacks off. That's social loafing. And that leads us nicely to de-individuation, because in this last slide we talk about they feel less accountable when they're in a group, right? Well, keep that in mind as we talk about de-individuation, which is mob mentality, and that there's a loss of self-awareness, right? And that them by themselves. And there's also a loss of self-restraint in group situations that foster arousal and anonymity. So there's a lot of variables that have to happen here in order for mob mentality to take place. And that they're in a large group that is arousing, right? And because it's a large group, they are anonymous, and that when they do things, no one's going to know. No one's going to point out Joe Bob did that because it was the mob. And so this doesn't always have to be in more serious riots that you see like in the news and stuff. But I guess all riots are kind of serious, but not in like necessarily all protests, but even after sports games, even after people win, right? And that their team wins and they go out and riot. I've never kind of wrapped my brain around that. But because it's the mob, the group, they do things that they wouldn't normally do. They lose that self-restraint. That's de-individuation. Okay, so how does behavior in the presence of others change? Well, we've got two last vocabulary terms here. There's group polarization. And I want you to think of polarization as being opposites, right? So enhances groups' prevailing attitudes through discussion. That's kind of what happens. So if a group is like-minded, discussion of whatever it is, whatever the topic is, whatever they're like-minded about, strengthens its prevailing opinions and attitudes. So have you ever been in a discussion with someone about a topic and you leave that discussion feeling all amped up, like, oh man, I'm totally like amped up and totally feeling this, like, yes, I'm so into my opinion and what I think? Of course you have. Everyone has done that. Well, that's group polarization. It can be beneficial, it can be harmful. Bottom line, you usually leave more fired up one way or the other than when you first arrived. I keep the same picture here on this next vocab term because they are similar in that you're having a discussion. But with group think, it's not everybody talking and everybody jiving and feeling all fired up about what they think. It's not that. Group think is where the way of thinking that kind of prevails over a group, even if some people disagree. So it's a way of thinking that occurs when the desire for harmony in decision making overrides possible alternatives. So I want you to think of like at a staff meeting or like a class meeting maybe. And the class president gets up on stage and is talking about, well, we're just going to have prom in the gym this year. And it seems as if everybody in the group is like, yeah, that's kind of what we've been talking about. We should totally do that. But even if like just one person or even like 50 people, and they're like, I totally don't agree with this. If group think prevails, then those individuals will bite their tongue, right? They'll keep their opinions to themselves because they don't want to make waves. So they just go along with the rest of it, the rest of the group's decision, or the decision of the most vocal member, so as to not break what appears to be harmony, even if that harmony doesn't actually exist. So that concludes our social influence part 2 notes. Make sure you stay tuned for our next set on antisocial relations, and everybody have a great day.